All right, well, I have two after here, so I say we go ahead and get started, everybody. Welcome to our October 3rd Thursday Web Forum. As always, I'm Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications in the South Atlantic, and we've been hosting this Web Forum every third Thursday of the month, right here at 10 a.m. for the last several years, and it's intended to give people like you a chance to ask questions and help provide feedback and input to sort of guide the direction that we're going as a conservation community here in the South Atlantic. So here's our usual agenda. Those of you who are regular attendees will be familiar with this, but I'll just start out by introducing our speakers. We'll get probably 30 to 40 minutes presentation from our speakers on our monthly topic, and then I'll pause for Q&A and discussion. After we wrap up the questions, I'll take a little bit of time to preview the next webinar and give some updates from your South Atlantic staff, and then we'll pause again for any further questions before we call it a day. So today we're going to be hearing from Analie Barnett and Dr. Mark Anderson. They're with the Nature Conservancy's Eastern U.S. Conservation Science Team, and they're going to be talking about a project that they're working on to evaluate thousands of different sites across the South Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico for their resilience and their capacity to migrate in the face of sea level rise. So before I hand it off to them, a couple of quick logistics. I'm going to put us in silent mode so that we don't have background noise, which means if you need to speak up at any time, just press *6 to unmute your line, or you can pose questions using the chat box, and I'll do my best to sort of insert those as we're going through today. So before I mute everyone, does anyone have any questions or concerns that they want to speak up about? All right, so I'm going to put us in silent mode.
The conference is now in silent mode.
So with that, Dr. Anderson, I think the floor is yours. I'm handing you the presenter power. Or if you want to just grab it from me, you can, and just remember to hit *6 to unmute your line, and then you can take us away.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Hillary and Rua, for inviting us to present on this project. I'm going to give the lead off and then pass it to Analie Barnett, who will get into some of the results in detail. The one thing to know, so this is a project funded by NOAA, through the COCA program, and also through the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And we are only about halfway through the project, so you'll see the part that we have finished. The goal of the project really is to evaluate and identify coastal sites from across the entire South Atlantic all the way through the Gulf of Mexico. So if you can see this map, we completed a parallel project to this in the Northeast that ran from Maine to Virginia, and that was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on Hurricane Sandy money. And this project is sort of the follow-up to that, and maybe the improvement in a lot of ways, which covers the rest of the Southeast coast. We actually assess and rank individual coastal sites. You'll see how that works. In the Northeast, we evaluated close to 11,000 individual sites. They were actually much smaller than the sites we're evaluating here, which is about 6,000 coastal sites. And the results from this will be maps and data sets that will allow users to assess any site of interest and measure its ecological resilience, and we'll explain what that means. And then there's also will be a report and some web tools that explain the methods, how we measured it, and how to interpret the results. We are over halfway through this project in the Southeast, and it's due next September, next year. There's at the last 4 or 5 months of the project, we will be doing rollouts through the different state offices. And the project itself is sort of the counterpart to what we call our terrestrial resilience project, which is a map that we worked on for almost a decade of places that are more resilient to climate change in the terrestrial world. And in that analysis, it's based, the results are based very much on microclimate diversity and connectedness. And when we released this map, we actually grayed out, if you see this little zoom in here, we just grayed out the areas of sea level rise and said, we did not evaluate sea level rise, so please don't use this map in these areas. And this was a follow-up project to look at the coastal areas. But one thing it has very much in common with the original analysis is it's based on physical properties, and you'll see what I mean. But it's properties of the geometry and the geomorphology of the coast that we think are enduring under climate change. So properties that will not change under climate change, and then we'll try and measure what actually will change. And much of this is written up, and we'll show you at the end if you want to read the report for the Northeast or any of the other projects. We have it all on a website. Okay, now this slide I probably don't have to go through with this particular group, but it's really why do we care about tidal habitats? And in the 1-minute sentence, they are extremely productive and diverse systems, perhaps one of the most productive systems on Earth. They have hundreds of rare species, and they provide resources for shorebirds and crabs and essential functions in stabilizing the shorelines. They make up a very small part of the Earth's ecosystems, but carry an extraordinary amount of diversity and productivity. But the challenge, of course, and the reason this project exists is because we're worried about loss and change in our tidal systems, intertidal systems, due to rising sea levels. And the research on sea level rise is very strong and consistent. There's differences, as you can see here, there are differences in the actual amount of sea level rise expected, depending on which model you follow. And you'll see later on how we dealt with these. Essentially we deal with it by running a whole bunch of different scenarios for each site. But there is consistency among all these models in that the sea level rise is increasing. And of course, we're seeing this little graph in the left. I think that's Wilmington that it's being pointed at. I can't quite read it myself, but it's high tiding and coastal storm surge is occurring more and more often in the U.S. and at higher and higher levels. So here's the real issue, this slide here, which is taken from Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge up in the Chesapeake Bay area in Maryland. And what you can see in these, this is really happening, and it's really pretty serious. So you can see this area in 1938 is a massive salt marsh with some cool tidal channels running through it. By 1974, much of that salt marsh is inundated by rising sea levels. And by 1989, almost that entire area is just open water. And this has been measured through satellite image analysis, and so in this area I'm showing, there's been a loss of about 5,000 acres. What it doesn't show is the slide here below where I drew in, there's been a gain. Although we've lost a certain amount of tidal marsh, there's also been a gain of about 3,000 new acres. And that gain is caused by the tidal marsh migrating inland in the areas where it actually can migrate inland. So we know that that's happened. We've seen it happen. The quality of the marsh is not perhaps as good as the original marsh, but it might get there over time. And so what we're facing is a potential loss of large amounts of marsh. We've measured this only for the Northeast right now, but at 2 feet of sea level rise, it would be a loss of 23% of the marsh if there was no migration inland. But with migration inland, we could actually gain 20% of the marsh. So that idea of which sites can migration actually happen and what can we do to assist that and what are the enabling conditions that allow migration to happen is really the key parts of this analysis. So when we started the analysis, we assembled a very large steering committee. And part of this was our own caution that we want to make sure these results, which maybe not everyone is going to like because they're somewhat sobering, but we wanted to make sure they were really rigorous and reviewed. So we have a collection of steering committee members from some of our federal agencies, a bunch of our state agencies, and nonprofit partners and academic partners. And then we have staff from the Nature Conservancy also within each of the states and regional staff. So we have a large steering committee, and they participate in a call about every 2 months to review material and discuss concepts and try new analyses. So they're on top of us. And they often send us back to the drawing board, which is great, because eventually we want to get this as correct as we can. So a few major concepts just that we're working with. So first of all, how do we define a coastal site? So we define a coastal site as sort of a complex of several things. The existing tidal complex, which you see here in blue, and that can include salt marsh, brackish marsh, and tidal flat. So we sort of mix those three together into one, what we call the tidal complex. Adjacent to that is the area that we call migration space. And the migration space is the area that's available. It's the adjacent lowland area available for migration where the tidal complex could move into under the right conditions. And then surrounding that area is an even larger area that we call buffer area, which is the upland area surrounding the migration space that could interact with the migration space or even allow even further migration at some point in the future. And I'll walk you through this in a little more detail, but I want to get these concepts in your mind first. So what makes a site resilient? And I think we've agreed pretty strongly on these now, although we're still working out how to measure them, as you'll see from Analie. But first we said, well, if a site has a large migration space, that's great. If that migration space has many tidal zones, which means that it would have many different habitats in the future, salt marsh, brackish marsh, tidal flat, that's good. If the existing tidal complex is large, that's good. And if there is a high shared edge, so you see here the edge between the existing tidal marsh and its migration space, those are all good factors that would help make this particular site resilient. And so we put those factors in what we call the physical scores, which are looking at whether the site has the physical capacity to migrate. And it doesn't mean that the site will migrate. It just means that it's possible for this site. In green, you see it's possible for this to migrate. At least physically, it has the correct factors. Then the second thing we look at is a condition score. That's what we are working on now. And the condition score is really, does it have the processes that would enable migration? So, and again, we can say, are there anthropogenic barriers that would prevent it? Is there an ample sediment supply that would facilitate migration? Is there adequate water quality so that the root development is good in the Spartina and that would help migrate? And is there freshwater flushing if it's a river-dominated system? So we look at the idea is, if the site has both a good physical signature and if it has the condition factors that would facilitate migration, those two things together would tell us that this site has all the necessary conditions needed to facilitate adaptation and migration. It doesn't necessarily say that it will. It just says it has all the enabling conditions. It might still need stewardship. So I've already said quite a bit about migration space, but just to make sure you're clear on this, it is the area of adjacent lowland that if the current sea level rises to a certain level, this would be area where the tidal complex could migrate into. And on the satellite image on the right, which is a large marsh in Plum Island, Massachusetts, you can see the orange is the migration space available under a certain sea level rise. And what's interesting about migration space, the absolute availability of it is very much physically determined. So here we are in Mobile Bay. You can see there is this purple area is a large low-lying wetland adjacent to the tidal marsh. and that area looks to be largely available in the future for the complex to move into. But if you look along these smaller coves and rivers here, there's much smaller areas in this second site. There's much smaller areas available for migration. And those are, again, very much physically determined, so we can only really look at their shape and configuration as to whether they are there. So finally, we did not develop our own models of migration space. What we did is we adopted models that were already out there from the NOAA sea level rise viewer, and what we did was we simplified. The sea level rise viewer actually predicts different kinds of marsh habitats to be there in the future. You may have looked at these. So for instance, future unconsolidated shoreline, future salt marsh, future brackish marsh, as shown in this graph. And those are being driven by whether by the different tidal zones that are the depth of inundation in the tidal zones in the future. And what we did here was simply say, well, there's a lot of uncertainty in whether those exact habitats will be there in the future, but there's not that much uncertainty that the area itself is the area that would be available for migration. So we just collapsed those models of individual habitats into one area that we called available migration space. So it's just a collapsing of the vegetation models. And then finally, we did compare this. We had a lot of discussion with our steering committee about the existing models already developed for this area, the ones that the South Atlantic LCC developed with the SLAM models that were developed, the NOAA Sea Level Rise Viewer, and the USGS models for the Gulf of Mexico. And what we did was we compared them all, and we actually integrated them together. So you can see on this map, the red areas are the places where they all agreed. And the blue areas are the tidal complexes. And then some of these other colors, the yellow and orange, are places where there was some slight disagreements. And what we did is we just integrated them into one model so that our migration space model, I think, is a really solid integration of the existing work that went before us and could be useful to all those existing projects. All right. Okay, if you're still with me, lastly, before I pass this over to Analie to really look at the results, the last sort of overarching concept we used was to divide the area of analysis into coastal shoreline types. And we did this because we really want to compare apples to apples. When we talk about what a resilient site is and how much migration space it has, and whether the processes are intact, we want to be sure we're comparing, for example, lagoons to other lagoons. So we pulled out areas that have these shallow enclosed waters, often have barrier beaches, and we classified those as lagoons. Ones that were dominated by large river systems that flushed their areas we called river-dominated. They're at the mouths of most of the large rivers in the southeast. And we also had ones that we called open bay, this large open area in Florida. Neither lagoons nor dominated by large rivers, but interacting really directly with the ocean, and island archipelago, which we called only the Keys. So we created a map here, you can see, and the map divides the study area into these different types of coastal shoreline types or shoreline regions. And when we do the final analysis, we will simply compare resilience within a certain coastal shoreline region, and you'll see how that goes. So we're comparing lagoons to lagoons or riverine to riverine. Here's a picture of how these two areas, these two lagoons, might get compared with each other, and the river-dominated system would be compared with other river-dominated systems. And that ensures, for conservation purposes, that we're identifying the most resilient sites of each of all of the different physical habitats, and hopefully then sustaining diversity by implementing conservation where that's needed. So with that, I will pass those general concepts. I'm going to pass this on to Analie, and she will dive into the results that we're starting to see and the ways that we actually measured the pieces.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Hillary, you can hear me okay?
I sure can. Yeah, you're both coming through loud and clear. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
So,
as Mark was saying, resilience factors are these measurable characteristics of a coastal site that increase the likelihood that the site can adapt to change and continue to sustain diversity. And we have two categories: the physical characteristics that reflect the topographic structure of a site, and the condition factors that support the process of marsh migration. So I'm going to start with looking at the physical characteristics of a site. And as Mark noted, we are about halfway through this project, and we've got the draft results for the physical component. And we've just started working on the condition part, which I'll go into a little bit, but just know that that's still very much a work in progress. So the four physical characteristics that the steering committee and our team agreed on are: how much migration space does a site have? Again, that's that space for future marsh. How many tidal zones are within that migration space? How much does that migration space share an edge with the tidal complex? And then how large is the current complex? And so I'll walk through each of these fairly briefly and how we measured them, and then we'll look at the condition factors. So as Mark was saying, migration space is that area of adjacent low-lying land that is potentially suitable for supporting tidal habitats in the future as the sea level rises. It's been called everything from accommodation space to future marsh to migration pathways. And as Mark noted and showed with the Blackwater site, its importance has already been documented in areas such as that. And sites vary widely in the amount of migration space they have. And you can see here in the site in Georgia, this tidal complex is shown in blue, and its migration space is shown for a range of scenarios from a half foot all the way to 6.5 foot with the darker colors. They're laid on each other progressively. So you can see the darker colors are when you get to higher sea level rise scenarios. And on the right is an image of our landform model, again, just showing that migration space is very much a reflection of the physical template that underlies a site. And a single tidal complex could have many non-contiguous regions of associated migration space. So our estimate of migration space size is based on the sum of all of those migration space areas for a particular sea level rise scenario. The next attribute that we look at is the number and evenness of tidal zones or tidal classes. And the distribution of tidal habitats corresponds to relatively distinct tidal zones, reflecting the degree of regular inundation. And some studies, again, as Mark noted, predict the type and extent, but we don't make predictions. Instead, we're thinking that the presence of a variety of tidal zones in the future will correspond to a more diverse set of habitats. And just want to note, there is disagreement among scientists as to how perfectly these tidal thresholds match actual habitat transitions, but there was agreement amongst our steering committee members, both in the Northeast and in the South Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico, that having many evenly distributed tidal classes within the migration space offers the potential for a larger variety of habitats in the future. And to measure this, we used the future vegetation predictions from both the NOAA sea level rise, marsh migration data, and the SLAM models. The USGS model in the Gulf of Mexico didn't have predicted vegetation types, so we used the NOAA and SLAM, and we simply just counted the total number of classes in the area of each within the migration space for each sea level rise scenario, and then calculated a Simpson's evenness index as a measure of the diversity and evenness of the tidal classes. The third physical attribute is the amount of shared edge between a tidal complex and its migration space. And we don't know that there isn't good research on this, but intuitively, we think that the migration of tidal habitats into the adjacent lowlands is likely facilitated when migration space is directly adjacent to those existing habitats and has a lot of shared edge. between the two. And you can see in the example on the left, this is the Big Bend area of Florida. It's been in the news a fair amount with the recent hurricane. It has this large tidal complex shown in blue, and it has a lot of shared edge with its migration space all along this entire coastline. Whereas when you look on the image on the right in the Mobile Bay, there's a lot of migration space for this tidal complex, but there are only small points where it actually is adjacent to that migration space. And since we don't know for sure how important this attribute is, it's weighted pretty low compared to some of the others. You might have noticed in Mark's slide that the physical characteristics had weights next to them. And so we do weight the attributes on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being those factors that have the most influence. And so for this one, we gave it a 2. And I'll talk more about the weights as we get into the scoring section. But to map this, we just intersected the tidal complex with the migration space to calculate how much of that tidal complex edge is actually shared immediately with the migration space. Our last physical attribute, is the size of the existing tidal complex. And we think it's likely to influence its ability to migrate because it's a primary source of biotic material. A large complex with many habitat types is likely to provide ample source material for migration. But again, this is another one of those that there's some uncertainty with, so we gave it a weight of 2 because most tidal complexes are already decreasing in size due to inundation and are likely not going to be stable over the next century. But we do think that if you look in this example here, this large tidal complex with the 3 arrows is approximately 15,000 acres in size, and we have these small little fragmented pieces down here around 2 acres. So we do want to give some weight to the fact that these small tidal complexes, which also don't have much migration space in this case, are unlikely to be resilient into the future. And what really hit us when we were looking at our initial draft results of the physical scores for the Gulf of Mexico and South Atlantic was, if sea level is rising and there is no available migration space, a tidal complex will most likely be inundated. So we really think that migration space is the critical variable that sets the context for the other variables. So we decided to establish some migration space size thresholds. And this example illustrates why. This area south of Lake Bourne in Louisiana has very little migration space, about 48 acres. So there's very little space for future marsh to develop. And if we don't establish a threshold, the other attributes are not as important if there's no migration space. So we worked with the steering committee to come up with 2 thresholds that we think will capture both to ensure that migration space is of adequate size. And the first threshold states that the migration size must be greater than the average migration size for its coastal shoreline region, those regions that Mark was showing that we'll be stratifying and comparing tidal complexes within one shoreline region to all the other tidal complexes in that same shoreline region. And then the second, just stop for a second to look at this image, all of the orange areas, the migration space, most of that migration space, because it's visible at this scale, is above average in size, just to give you a sense of what that above average might look like in practice. And then the second criterion was, and this was brought up by some steering committee members, it's a good point, that there could be small sites that don't have as much migration space to make that threshold of being greater than average, but relative to the size of the current tidal complex, it's going to be increasing that size of the tidal complex because there's so much migration space relative to the existing size. So our second threshold is to make sure that we do capture those small sites that are getting larger. And to do that, we look at sites that have average migration space that is at least as big as the current complex, and it's predicted to increase in size, and it doesn't occur on a barrier island with a downward trend in size. Although we'll note we don't apply that to the island archipelago shoreline region because those are all islands. But and in this case, this little box here shows you the number of tidal complexes that we were able to pick up with the 2 different thresholds. So that second threshold picks up an additional 58 in the Gulf of Mexico and 35 in the South Atlantic. And here's, again, showing for the South Atlantic, some sites scored far above average for their migration space, and then all the sites are ranked, but the ones that aren't showing scored average or lower for their migration space. And you can see here, I'm just zoomed in, even though these met the threshold, they still scored slightly below average for those other attributes. So that threshold is that first cut, but you still have the other attributes to get your resilience score. And the numbers in parentheses just show for each region, the Gulf of Mexico and the South Atlantic, the number that met out of the number of tidal complexes that met these two criteria. These are the ones that had a greater than average physical score once we integrated all those attributes we just talked about. So we do have our draft physical scores for the tidal complexes, and we have them in our map viewer. The steering committee's been looking at these results, and if you're interested, please feel free to take a look at an area of interest. I apologize for this URL. It's a bit crazy because it's a interim web viewer. It's not our final. That's the best I could do with the link here. So, but you're welcome to view our draft physical scores, and if you have any feedback, feel free to send us an email. It would be great to have more eyes on this, of course. So I'll move now into our condition characteristics. And so the condition factors describe those characteristics that increase the probability of a tidal complex moving into the migration space. And the physical factors focused on the size and configuration of the migration space, whereas the condition factors focus on the processes that enable the migration or formation of new tidal complexes. And the four that we are showing here are the ones from our Northeast analysis. And as Mark noted, this project is in progress, and we're currently working on the condition component. These could change, or we might have additional ones, but just to note that these are the ones based on our Northeast work, and that we have just a couple of examples are mapped for the South Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico that I'll walk through. So the first one is the armored shoreline characteristic, which tidal complexes that have a lot of their shoreline hardened by roads and docks and other anthropogenic barriers are going to be less likely to migrate. So we calculated the percent of armored shoreline for each tidal complex using the most current NOAA ESI shoreline data. So first we extracted the man-made shoreline from the ESI and then spatially linked it to the tidal complexes and then compared that to the full ESI shoreline for each complex. And I should note the categories here are arbitrary. We'll be, again, comparing these tidal complexes to to all the other ones that are within their same coastal shoreline region. And we'll do that for the two separate regions. So the South Atlantic sites will be compared to all the coastal shoreline regions in that region. And then the Gulf of Mexico will be another separate comparison. But just to note, the areas in red are tidal complexes that have greater than 50% of their shoreline in some sort of hardened structure as mapped by the ESI data. And the second condition attribute I can show you is it's different than what we did in the Northeast, and so we'll see what our steering committee in the South thinks about this. But it's the present-day global sediment balance. So watershed-derived sediment is a key source of tidal wetland accretion, and declines in sediment delivery due to ag and dams have been shown to play a major role in tidal wetland declines. And this recent study just came out in September that was published in Nature, did a really robust analysis of global coastal wetlands, and they looked at two key factors. The first was with migration space, which they call accommodation space, and they looked at sediment. And incidentally, they found that migration space was the biggest predictor of future wetlands being sustained in the face of sea level rise, and the sediment actually wasn't as big of a factor. But it's still something we want to look at. And so this particular data set shows the difference between the suspended sediment concentration needed for coastal wetlands to build up vertically in light of current sea level rise rates and with the actual total suspended matter concentration derived from some new satellite data. And so you can see for most of the Gulf of Mexico, there's a deficit. Actually, for most of the South Atlantic, there's a deficit. There's only, and even just having a small amount of 5 surplus is not really considered a very good sediment balance. So the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, most of the sites based on the data, which again, thanks to the authors for being willing to share their data. They were very interested in this project and we're happy to share their data. So we're excited to present this to the steering committee and get their feedback on it. But again, just gives us an indication of the sediment balance for these tidal complexes, and it's not surprisingly in Louisiana, it's quite sediment starved. So these are just 2 examples of some condition metrics, and again, we'll be working on those additional ones in this fall and in winter. And as Mark noted in the intro, there's a lot of uncertainty in sea level rise projections. This particular map is interesting. It's a regionalization of those new NOAA global mean sea level rise scenarios. And by regionalization, they take into account local factors such as ocean circulation patterns and vertical changes in elevation such as subsidence or uplift. And as you can see on the right, the 3 intermediate high, and extreme scenarios, the Gulf of Mexico and the South Atlantic, all are projected to be higher. Relative sea level rise is projected to be higher than the global average under all those 3 scenarios. And the Gulf of Mexico, especially the Louisiana area, due to all that subsidence, is also expected to have a much higher relative sea level rise compared to the global mean projections. So to try to account for this uncertainty, we took 3 steps. And the first was to have multiple sea level rise scenarios. And we have 5 that we've agreed on. They go from the 0.5 foot to 6.5 foot. And the reason we have these particular scenarios, as Mark noted, for the Gulf of Mexico, we augmented our migration space that we had calculated from the NOAA data. We augmented it with data from USGS and SLAM. And these were the scenarios that they had in their project. So it made sense to tie them to these. And just for those of you that think in meters, that 0.5 foot is about 0.5 meter, the 3 foot is that 1 meter scenario, and the 4 foot is approximately the 1.2 meter, and the 6.5 is approximately 2 meters. And the migration space scenarios represent the aggregate amount of migration space across all scenarios minus the amount lost to open water. And I should note too that all scenarios will be available to users of this project, but we plan to tie the project's results to the 6.5 foot scenario so that we can define resilience in a long-term way. And we just want to note some important caveats about that. We're not saying that a specific area will experience 6.5 feet of sea level rise by 2100, but rather Site A is likely or unlikely to be resilient up to that 6.5 foot level of sea level rise. And another suggestion from the steering committee in our last call was that since 3 feet or 1 meter of sea level rise is a common scenario for a lot of locations, that would be a good one to include. So rather than having 2 sets of final results, I think what we'll do is show how a site's resilience differs between that 3 to 6.5 foot scenario. In the Northeast, there was a big difference. Sites that looked resilient at 3 feet could not be resilient when you got to that 6.5 foot scenario. And conversely, there could be sites that had a huge uptick in migration space once you got over that 3 foot sea level rise scenario. And then the second step we took to try to deal with all the uncertainty is to look at the trend of the size of the migration space across those later scenarios, the 3, 4, and 6.5 foot scenarios, to find sites where the migration space was actually increasing over time. And we did this by fitting a regression line to the size of the new migration space across those 3 scenarios. And so sites where the regression shows significant and positive trend will have their final score boosted by 0.5 standard deviation to reflect that future trajectory for that site does look promising. And then the last step we took was to look at the buffer area, which is the natural. Oh, I should note, this is just an illustration of how that additional trend would be incorporated into the score. So you have your physical score here. We have a hypothetical condition score. They're combined and divided by 2. You get your resilience score, and then you could add a half standard deviation value to that final score. And I'll talk a little bit more about how our scores are in units of z-scores or standard deviations, and we have different categories to show how far above average a site scores relative to its coastal shoreline region. So this last step that we took to account for uncertainty was to look at the natural and agricultural land immediately surrounding the tidal complex, which we call the buffer area. And it's important because it influences the condition and ecological processes occurring in the tidal complex and its migration space. And the attributes that we look at for the buffer area are its size and how well does it actually buffer the migration space. And then a new one we're looking at for the southeast is the presence of Maritime Highlands. So these are areas of higher elevation that are embedded in lowlands and along the coast. And then the third physical characteristic is, are there lots of landforms that are compatible with the coastal landforms that are in that buffer area? And for condition, we could look at, does that buffer area have a lot of natural cover, and does it have a lot of wetland connectivity within it? And so the characteristics that decrease are obviously the opposite of those. So these are attributes that, again, we want to reflect that this buffer area might be future migration space after 6.5 feet sea level rise. So we want to try to take into account the condition of that buffer area. So here's where we get into the scoring. And as I mentioned, each attribute has a weight from 1 to 5, with 5 indicating the most influence on resilience. And for our physical score, the migration space tidal complex component accounts, we're looking at around 80 to 90% of the final physical resilience score. And then those buffer area attributes that I just talked about would be about 10 to 20%. We're going to do a little sensitivity analysis to see. Some folks in our steering committee like 10% and some like 20%. So we'll be experimenting with these. But these are combined to calculate the full physical score. And similarly, we'll do the same thing with the condition score. And as we haven't delved into these attributes, we haven't determined the weights for these yet, but they will be on that same scale from 1 to 5. And just another example of bringing all those attributes together into that final resilience score, which could be boosted if a site's migration space is showing a positive trend. It's increasing over time. And this is there's a lot more details in our report for the Northeast if folks are interested in all the details of the scoring approach. And just a reminder that all those scores are relative to the coastal shoreline region within which that tidal complex occurs. And again, that would be by region. So the South Atlantic will be one analysis, and the Gulf of Mexico will be another separate analysis. And lastly, just to wrap up, and I'm going to talk about some ways in which the results from this analysis could be used to develop conservation and restoration strategies. And these examples are all from our completed analysis in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And the first one is land protection. So a lot of our coastal marshes are already protected due to their outstanding value for people and nature. But unfortunately, a lot of the land that immediately surrounds the marsh is either unprotected or already developed. So in this example here, the migration space shown this is in Maine is unprotected, but it could provide over 450 acres of new coastal habitats. And this is actually an area that Maine has identified as a protection priority because it is the largest unsecured migration space for Maine. We found we all had a similar conclusion. We looked at this analysis. So one way to use these results is to take a look at the migration space areas that come out as important and look at their land securement and also the future projections of the land development for that area. A second way in which these results could be used is to look at natural solutions. The coastal zone is the most densely populated area of the U.S. and is expected to continue to grow. And resilient marshes that could potentially mitigate the effects of storm surge and sea level rise on densely populated areas can be identified, which we've shown here. There's large population areas, but there's not much migration space for these sites here shown in brown, which indicate they didn't score very high for their resilience, whereas these sites here in green have a lot of migration space, and they're also near densely populated areas. This is just another example from Virginia to show a similar thing. We've got a large population with a lot of migration space for these tidal complexes to move, so it might inform protection, stewardship, et cetera, of that migration space as we go forward. And lastly, another way is to find sites that may have relatively large amounts of migration space, but the ability of their habitats to migrate could be undermined by anything from armored shoreline to poor water quality or to low sediment. And each of these conditions could be improved by local conservation efforts. And so in this case, you can see here we've got a good physical score. So this site has good migration space availability, but over here it scored poorly for hardened shoreline, water quality, and sediment supply. So these are characteristics that might influence how that site's managed going forward. So lastly, to wrap up, Mark indicated we have our Resilient Coast website here at nature.org/resilient coast. We just have our Northeast work here, but it's I think we're improving upon it in the South Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, but we have a fair number of resources if you're interested. Our final report for the Northeast. We have a Coastal Resilience Strategy Story Map, which talks about some of the strategies I just mentioned, as well as several others. We have a web map where you can interact with the data. And then also all the data sets are available for download. Again, we tied the final results for this particular location to 6 feet, but we do have the data sets for all the scenarios that we looked at in this example. And so with that, I'll wrap up and hand it over to Hillary.
Thank you so much. What a really, really interesting talk. I'm super excited about the potential for applying this data in the South Atlantic and using it to inform decision making and potentially improve the blueprint. So we do have some time for questions. I'm going to go ahead and take us out of silent mode so that it's a little bit easier for us to have a good interactive Q&A. So hang on a sec.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So this means I'll just need everyone to please be mindful of their mute button so that we don't have a lot of background noise if you're not currently speaking. But does anyone have any questions for Analie or for Mark?
Yeah, this is Linda Reimer at EPA, and we've been thinking a lot in the Southeast about thin layer application of dredge material to coastal marshes to help them migrate, and thinking about how this could interact with what you're doing. What I wanted to ask was, is this data being used up in the Northeast now? I'm just curious about how the information gets out, to people who can use it, and so are you going to be looking at examples for how all these great numbers and information up in the Northeast gets translated into resilient wetlands?
Yeah, this is Mark. I can take that one. It is being used. I'm racking my brains to think if it's being used for a sediment supply. I'm not sure it is yet, but it's being used mainly for land conservation decisions, both by the Nature Conservancy and by a number of coastal land trusts, and also to inform where we should focus our messaging in terms of coastal systems as buffers from storms. So we're trying to focus on areas where there is migration space and there's potential for the marshes to really buffer communities. And also for thinking about restoration, which is where the sediment comes in That's a great question. I can't think of anywhere that I know of where it's been used to make determinations about where to do thin layer spreading.
Right. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
This is Beth Stiles in Florida. I have two questions. They're related. So we have mangroves here, and I was curious, were mangroves included as the one type that's shown? Are they included with the salt marsh? And then sort of the second follow-up is, does this include any accommodations for the potential for mangroves to expand northward and some of those changing dynamics of the northward expansion of mangroves?
I can take that one, Mark, or try. Yeah. So we use the NOAA SEACAST data so we'll have to look at how mangroves were mapped. There's not a separate category for them in SEACAST, but I believe they were picked up in that category. But I'll have to look closer at that. And we don't consider since we don't know what's going to be there in the future, we don't look at a specific community dynamics. It's probably the best way to answer your second question, I think, unless you have anything to add to that, Mark.
No, I agree. So we don't look at specific community dynamics, but you could look at where existing mangrove marshes are and what the capacity of those sites are to facilitate migration. That would be interesting overlay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just asking because I think their ability to shift will probably be different than the actual salt marsh, the herbaceous marshes, and so it could add another level of complexity to try to model these things, but I think their migration abilities might be different.
Great question and food for thought, Beth. Anyone else want to chime in? Probably have time for one more question. You can always use the chat box too if you're shy. Nothing wrong with that. Okay, well, hearing none, I'm going to take presenter power back here just for a couple more minutes and wrap up with a preview of next month's web forum and give you a couple of updates from South Atlantic staff here. So next month, we're going to be getting a presentation on November 15th, same time, same connection information today. And we'll be hearing from Amy Keister, who's our very own GIS coordinator here for the South Atlantic Blueprint, as well as Brendan Ward, who's with the Conservation Biology Institute, and he's a programmer and designer who's done a lot of the behind-the-scenes development for the Conservation Planning Atlas and for the South Atlantic Simple Viewer. So basically, the Simple Viewer for the current version of the South Atlantic Blueprint, version 2.2, it's been updated with a lot of new and exciting functions. It's still kind of the same easy-to-use viewer that you know and love, but you can still select a subwatershed, a marine lease block, explore the blueprint and the indicators in that area. But some of the new features in this update include sea level rise charting, showing projected sea level rise inundation as well as urban growth for each watershed. You can now download a report for each watershed or for a marine lease block, and that's in Microsoft Word, so you can copy and paste that text and use it in your grants or in your plans. There's now a pixel mode that's really, really cool and allows you to see exactly why a specific area has been prioritized in the blueprint based on how it scores in the indicators. And now it is a mobile-friendly design, so you can now use the Simple Viewer on your cell phone or a tablet. So this is going to be a really exciting presentation. I encourage you to tune in. Amy and Brendan will be doing a thorough overview of these new features and a live demo kind of showcasing the new stuff. But it is live, so you're welcome to go and play with it on your own. A couple of staff updates. Rua is going to give us a quick update on a future indicator modeling project that he's been working on.
Yeah, and actually what I'm going to do super quick here is I'm going to go steal this screen because I stole a picture from Mark to make this nice little transition between this. Nice. So on the fly.
I love it.
Because it was perfect. So basically this is a nice fit in as Mark and Analie are talking about sort of what are these enduring features that regardless of how fast the marshes occupy that migration space, what are going to be these most resilient sites? So one of the things we've been doing as part of looking into this larger question about the future of all the South Atlantic indicators we've been looking at predicting some of the change in some of the salt marsh and freshwater marsh indicators. And so this picture that Mark showed this difference in what if the marshes fill in all the migration space versus what if they fill in none of it, is a really key component and challenge we sort of run into. How do you forecast the future when the models up at this top here show things like, well, it could be anywhere from increase by 20% or we could lose 23% of it. So what are the trajectories and where is that marsh going right now? And so that's part of a larger project we've been working on to predict future indicator condition. And so in this, let me see if I can get rid of this annoying little thing here. Oh, that did not help at all.
The screen looks fine what I'm looking at, Rua.
Oh, interesting.
Be on yours, yeah.
It just blew everything up to a giant picture here. 1 second. Well, I will just keep going because I know what the slide looks like, even though I can't see what the slide looks like. There we go. So part of this larger project, we've been trying to look at future probability of salt marsh based on sub-regional patterns of change. So, well, okay, there's this migration space, but what's the rate and pattern of which it's being filled? And so we originally tried to use both past trends and future models, but the problem is the future models assume everything is going to be filled with salt marsh, and that does not seem to be the case based on past data at all. And so we've there's a few other technical reasons why we didn't use it. So we switched to just kind of extrapolating out some of the past patterns we're actually seeing. And that's what you see this picture at the bottom. This is the South Coastal Plain and sort of a percent change in salt marsh predicted into the future. So we're actually doing this in sort of a probabilistic GIS approach of forecasting the probability of different pixels transitioning, but basing it on the actual change we're observing and then moving that into the future. So if we see the same rate over the next 10 years, what might that look like? So that's going to be really nice and complementary to the existing other models we have out there, and it's still a work in progress, but wanted to give y'all an update on this since it's very relevant to this whole question about coastal resilience and our marshes keeping up. So that's a super quick update on that.
Awesome.
And
Thanks,
Hillary, you can have it back.
That's very cool.
Yeah, I hadn't had a chance to talk to Analie and Mark about it yet, so I was like, oh, they'll get the update too.
Great. Yeah, I'd love to discuss that further with y'all. Second staff update, just again, I wanted to give Mallory the chance to talk a little bit about the upcoming stuff with the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SEACAST, that'll be going on at the SEAFWA annual meeting next week. Mallory?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Mallory Martin here. A really quick update. We've been doing some preparation, getting ready for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SEACAST, update and presentations at the upcoming Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies SEAFWA meeting that will be next week. And as part of that, there's an updated blueprint priority map, which you're seeing an image of there. That's draft version 3.0. Includes some new threat layers for sea level rise, urbanization, and even a solar probability layer. Also, we've been active in refreshing the SEACAST website and providing some additional information there and updated information on stories of how people are actually using the Southeast Blueprint and the SEACAST information itself to guide their decision-making for conservation action. Along those lines, we're featuring improved levels of user support, so we're reaching out to people in all of the 15 southeastern states to offer up assistance and guidance in helping apply the action of Blueprint to on-the-ground decision-making. And in that regard, we listed and have some new information going out that shows a lead contact person for each of the 15 states in the Southeast region, and we'll be presenting that as well as some revised fact sheet and other information at the SEAFWA conference next week. In addition to that, we will be reporting out to the board of the Southeastern Association Directors, and as part of that report out, we'll be presenting a recommendation from the points of contact who have been working over the course of the past year to develop a draft overarching goal for the SEACAST initiative. So we're looking forward to all of that and hope to report out on some accomplishments coming from that meeting in future calls.
Great, thanks, Mallory. Yeah, if you happen to be at SEACAST, definitely stop by our booth and say hey to Rua and Mallory and Bess, who's on the line, and we'll be there as well. So I always like to end on this slide, how to get involved in the blueprint. Definitely still encourage you to join the South Atlantic LTC web community to get our newsletter and a monthly reminder email about this web forum. You can reach out to your blueprint staff. That's me and Louise and Amy and Mallory and Rua here in Raleigh, or connect with other members of the LTC. And you can explore the Conservation Blueprint online and reach out to us if you'd like help using it in your proposals or to inform your decisions. I know we're past 11, but this was a really, really great presentation and a lot of good detail. So I want to pause one more time to see if anyone has questions that have come up for Mark or for Analie or for me or the rest of the staff here. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Hope to see you in November, and have a great rest of your week and a good weekend.